Well, hello from St. Peter's Anglican Church here in Comox on Vancouver Island. I'm the Reverend Alan Naylor, the interim priest in charge while the parish is undergoing a discerning and searching process towards calling a new rector in due course. And happy Labor Day weekend to all. We give thanks together for all workers who put in their efforts for the good of communities everywhere. And we also recognize all who, in the past and in the present, strive towards fairness and safety for all working people. And I hope you are enjoying these last few bits of beautiful summer weather as we look forward to the fall. Well, today in Luke's Gospel, Chapter 14, we read as follows. Once, when Jesus was eating a meal in the house of a leader of the Pharisees, he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor. So he said, "When you're invited to a banquet, don't sit down in the place of honor, in case your host comes and says to you, 'Give this more distinguished person your place,' and then, in disgrace, you'd have to take a lower place. So, when you're invited, sit down at the lowest place, and then your host may come and say, 'Friend, move up higher,' and then you'll be honored in the presence of all." And then comes the key line from Jesus. "For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Let me repeat that line. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all those who humble themselves will be exalted. Being humbled doesn't come easy, does it? You know, I haven't always been an Anglican priest. For the first 20 years of my career, I worked in the business world, in finance and operations. And back in the 1990s, I was appointed to represent my company on a committee of industry and government people who were developing a new government policy. In hindsight, it was no big deal. The committee has disappeared into obscurity a long time ago. But at the time, I was very proud. In fact, I was a bit smug, to be honest. I saw it as my chance to gain status in the business world. And so I arrived at the first meeting in a posh downtown Toronto hotel, dressed in my best three-piece suit and loaded for bear, as they say. Well, when it got to my turn to make my presentation, the chairman said, "We'll take a coffee break." And I thought, well, that's great. It'll give me a few extra moments to prepare to wow the audience. But as I stood up, I happened to look down. And to my horror, I noticed I was wearing one black shoe and one brown. Now, in hindsight, all these years later, I realize I should have just carried on. No one would have noticed. But you know, for a vain, ambitious young man, it was the worst possible scenario. My presentation did not go well. I was so focused on self-consciously keeping my feet out of view. And then I called my wife, who, God bless her, came all the way downtown with a black shoe and a brown shoe, so I could choose which pair I wanted. So much for my grand entrance, which turned into a rather humbling experience. And I remember driving all the way home. Jesus' words were ringing in my head. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So about that word, humble, sorry to talk language again, but often, breaking down the words from ancient languages chosen when the Bible was written, and understanding what they meant in their time, that can bring extra insight. And this is a good example. In its Greek form, the word tapeinos was used, which means to be very low to the ground, almost in the earth. And so in Greek it was something like, those who exalt themselves will be brought low, very low, and those who lower themselves will be brought up. But when it was translated into the English word humble, excuse me, it came from the Latin form, which has the same root as the word humus, or soil. So to be humble is to be like soil itself. Now, I'm a keen, but not a great gardener. Much as I'd like to just stick something in the ground, water it, and watch it grow, it took me quite a long time to finally understand it's all about the soil, what's underneath, with nutrients for healthy growth. Composting, of course, is essential to making healthy soil, and the most important part of good compost is that black stuff called humus, not to be confused with hummus, which is that tasty dip made from chickpeas. Humus is organic matter that has decomposed so much that it will not break down any further under normal conditions. It allows tiny organisms to feed and reproduce, which generates nutrients and helps the soil retain moisture. And although it smells bad and is dirty, humus is really good stuff. It could be described as the life force in the soil. And just as the ancients recognized that good soil is essential for growing things, they also recognized that being humble is a good thing, so much that they used similar words for both. Well, in our 21st century culture, self-promotion and pride in oneself are virtues. Humility, well, it has a bit of a bad rap, doesn't it? It does seem about as attractive as a pile of compost. But if we think of the function of humus, how helpful it is to new growth, then in a human life, the equivalent of humus, being humble, is a willingness to be fertile and open to new growth. When you and I are living up to our potential as humble, spiritual human beings, we are functioning like humus, not in the sense of rotting organic material, but in the sense of being good soil out of which new life emerges, both for ourselves and for others, and then to bear fruit for someone else's comfort, someone else's peace of mind, someone else's growth. We don't have time today to talk about another reading which we will see on Sunday from the letter to the Hebrews, but that's what the writer there alluded to when they were talking about hospitality for all, compassion for prisoners and those in any kind of difficulty, and also contentment with what we have and sharing it. Now, there's an important but in all of this. But being humble does not mean being a doormat. It does not mean being there to be taken advantage of or accepting abuse. Rather, like humus, it does mean being down to earth, grounded, realistic, and confident within one's limitations. As that letter to the Hebrews puts it, with confidence we can say, "The Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid." So being humble means being teachable. It means being able and willing to grow and change always to the very end. Old dogs can learn new tricks when they are open to it. It means there's room for listening to others, for new understanding. In order to be humble, we don't see ourselves as less than other people. We just realize that each is as important and as God-loved as ourselves. That's the self-sacrificing model that Jesus made of his own life. I'm sure in your gardens and your compost piles, there's lots of that black stuff, that humus. But the question for us today is about the garden within. Are we keeping grounded? Are we humble enough, unexalted enough to allow the Spirit of the living God to decompose us and then recompose us in order that we might be exalted, not for our own purposes or for our peers to be impressed, but for God's purposes in the world. Amen. And now, as always, I wish you and all whom you love God's richest blessings, today and always, wherever you are. Hope to see you next week.